Today is March 18th, and this is a regular meeting of the Estes Park Planning Commission. We'll do quick introductions. I'm Chairman Cooper.
Dave Arterburn.
Richard Mulhern.
And we also have Planning Staff Committee.
Carol Washam.
Steve Garaccia, Community Development Director.
And our attorney.
Dan Kramer.
All right, we're all present. I would like to have our Planning Commission consider approval of our agenda.
So moved.
So move.
A second.
Move in a second. Any additions or changes to that agenda? Okay. All in favor, raise their hand.
Raise your hand. Very good.
Okay, we have approval of the agenda. Next on the agenda is review of the consent agenda. The consent agenda is the Planning Commission minutes dated February 18th of 2025. I would ask if there are any additions or deletions or changes to that from our
Not
members.
that I found.
Okay, entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
Second. Second.
Okay, and one last chance for any changes.
No, I
Okay.
checked it out.
All right. All in favor, raise their hand by signifying say aye. Yes. So consent agenda of the Planning Commission minutes from February 18th has passed. Next on our agenda would be any public comment. Now, Karen, just as a point of clarification, do we have anybody that's called in or is online that you're aware
No,
of?
not today.
Okay, any public comment from our members here? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to our discussion item. And first on the agenda is our guest speaker, Scott Moulton, who is the director of the Estes Park Housing Authority, with a discussion of all things related to housing.
I don't know if we'll talk about all things, but we're prepared to talk about a lot.
We do have our joint meeting following at about 2:30, I believe, is when our trustees are going to come in. So keeping in mind, I think you all have several questions. And if you would prefer us to hold those until the end, or if we just could interrupt you as they come up, what would be your preference?
So I'm prepared to talk about a host of things, and as such, I have a wonderful slide deck here, which is a short 89 slides long.
Okay.
I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm doing something a bit unique that I'm prepared to sort of talk about any direction we want to go.
Okay.
So there's slides on a lot of topics that we might cover here today. So I want this to be collaborative and kind of as much Q&A as you all want to make, and I want to make sure that you all use me as a resource here today to discuss about housing from not only EPHA's perspective, but as a houser as well.
Okay.
So once again, just to introduce myself, Scott Moulton, Executive Director of the Estes Park Housing Authority.
Yeah, and I know just from my perspective that, I'd like to be as clear as we can about the different definitions of housing and how those apply when we get requests for rezoning changes that might include a housing development of some sort. So please proceed.
There we go. I think we might be okay, unless you did that. So again, I paused there because I noticed I may have sent you the wrong one because there's something missing already. So we'll go through it and see where we're at. But I do want this conversation to be as collaborative as possible. Ask questions. Again, I want to make sure I answer any questions that you might have, and hopefully I can provide answers to your questions. I do want to start with a quote that if you've heard me speak before, you've seen this before, but I think it's important to share almost each and every time we talk about housing. And it's this: our great American housing depression is fueled by our cultural aversion to one another. We are neighbors, we're not invaders. Until we ask ourselves why we are afraid of one another, the depression rages on. Often in these conversations, in my view, we get stuck on talking about what we call sticks and bricks. Talk about the physical aspect of a home. What we're really talking about is where people raise families, where they can lay their head at night, where they can feel safe, comfortable. That's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about families and individuals' safety, shelter for them and their loved ones. we're not just talking about sticks and bricks. And I think it's important for us to remember that when we have these conversations. We're talking about people, we're talking about our neighbors and our fellow community members. So I did want to go through some terminology we use, make sure that we're all comfortable with the definitions we're using, not only sort of in the housing space, but also how it relates to what's in the development code. I know, was it back in, when was the meeting? January? Where you all discussed sort of some definitions, and really that was the catalyst for me coming in front of you today to offer our perspective. So, how are you all feeling about how we define affordable, attainable workforce? What those terms mean, what they don't mean, how we use them in the development code?
Not good.
Not good. All right. So let's cover them, and hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on what those are.
Yeah, so I think part of the problem is that when we have these conversations is that the terms get used incorrectly. The editorial article in the paper today, this week did a nice job trying to clarify that, but it still had errors. It used attainable where it should have said workforce, or it used affordable where it should have used attainable. And so I think we've really got to be careful about the definitions and how we use them, because I think people throw them around improperly, and it gets the community confused about what we're doing when we try to use them properly, and then the definitions that get put out in the paper and other things are used incorrectly. So I think it's important for us to get these definitions clear, and then more importantly, how those definitions get applied within the construct of the development code. Because I think there's some need for improvement in the update to the development code relative to the use of these terms, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the community.
So I'll try to provide some linear thought here as we dive into the definitions and how it relates to the development code, again, from our perspective. And the most recent editorial, I assume you're referring to the one written by Trustee Brown.
Yes.
I read it when it first came out. I provided some input, really just to verify the correctness of the numbers that were in the article. So I'm pretty familiar with it. I did not see any inaccuracies in the definitions that were provided in that article. But let's dive into what they are.
But what's really one of the problematic things about that article is, in all of the numbers that were used, they're 150% of AMI numbers. But how does that relate to people that live in the community? So when I look at some of those numbers that say, hey, rent for 30%, for a single can be 44.37. I'm looking at that going like, who here that's single and working a single job can afford that kind of rent? And so they're not making 150% of AMI. So I think that's one of those things that where you look at that at first, it doesn't quite makes the definitions confusing.
I want to come back to that. I was trying to change slides, but I can't.
You might have to point it to me.
I hate those clickers.
Yeah, so it
Never
is-
work when you need it to.
It is not working. So it'll be a little bit awkward not having control of that.
All right, tell me where you want to go.
It's going to be pretty deep in. Just keep arrowing. I'll tell you when to stop. Stop. Oh, go 3 back. One more. Yep. Yep. So we'll leave this up here so we can discuss what AMI means as we talk about the definitions of workforce, attainable, affordable, and affordable with a capital A as well. So we can put real numbers to what these AMIs translate to in terms of income, and then of course hourly wage. So let me backtrack just a little bit in that setting a baseline from a development code perspective as ours is written now. And it does have a definition of attainable and workforce. The definition of attainable, in very simple terms, it gets slightly more complicated, but in simple terms, it's 150% AMI or lower.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see what that number equates to based on the size of the household up above. Workforce is defined as one occupant, age of 18 years of older, that resides in the unit, works within the school district boundary, full stop. That's how it's defined in the development code. When we have an example,
And
I'm gonna take
that's for attainable, right?
attainable is 150% AMI or lower.
Right.
Workforce is that one member 18 years of age or older works within the school district boundaries year round on an average.
Okay, so
year-round
so in a Venn diagram, attainable and workforce overlap at that 150% of AMI or less.
at anything less than 150% AMI. Yes.
Right, that's the only place workforce and attainable overlap.
No, they would overlap then. They could overlap from 150% or lower all the way down.
That's what I said.
To 0.
150 or less, all the way down.
Correct.
They overlap only in that section. Anything above 150% of AMI, they don't overlap, right?
Then you separate.
That's just workforce housing. They just have to
That's
live
correct.
within the boundary.
Correct.
Okay.
Work within the boundaries. Correct.
Let me ask
Yes.
you a real quick question, because I think this gets confusing for me.
Mhm.
If the development that came to us last December was looking for a density increase because of workforce housing, if they would have said, I want 6 units to be attainable housing, considered attainable, would that threshold have applied? If you made more than 150%, you could not rent that unit or buy that unit.
If when we got to the final deed restriction and the agreement between the developer and the town, and they looked to use the attainable definition, that would have capped household income for those units at 150% or lower.
That's all I need.
There are currently 2 developments that use both. So qualified occupants can meet either the workforce criterion or the attainable criterion. And I think there's an important piece to this that I want to spend a moment to dive into from a houser's perspective. And that is, if you recall, during one of your recent applications for a rezone, there was a part of the discussion was architect Steve Lane discussing a little bit of the history of the previous bonus density, and that it wasn't utilized a single time in 17 years.
17 years, yeah.
While we can't know the exact reason it wasn't used, I can take some pretty good guesses from the seat that I sit in my experience. And that is when you put economic restrictions around equity, if that equity can't find a return, whether we like it or not, that equity is not going to put itself to use. Or the people that are holders of that equity aren't going to put it to use, because you're restricting their ability to realize a return. And that's without a value judgment, whether that return is 0.5% or 22%. Doesn't make a difference. If the equity doesn't believe that the risk they're taking will provide a reasonable return based on that risk because of the economic conditions that are put on it, you're going to get zero movement. And we saw that with the previous bonus density. The market, housing operates in this weird space. We believe it operates as a free market. It doesn't. We restrict it through zoning laws, everything that's related. We restrict how the free market actually works. There are districts in Texas, for example, the planners in this room can speak to this better than I can, that don't have zoning regulations or extremely light zoning regulations. And those are probably the examples that we have closest in our country that demonstrate what an actual free housing market or development market could operate. The market will deliver what the market wants, what it will pay for, and what it needs. But we restrict that market in multitude of ways. So it's correct to say that if the developer wanted to use the attainable threshold, it would cap that. But there are a number of developers in town that have balked at that because of the restriction sitting at 150. We can dive into what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate, but that is the reality of how capital markets work, how those that have the equity seek to, they're doing work they expect a return, and particularly on top of the high risk environment that development is. And I'll highlight just one more thing on that note. EPHA as a developer sits in the same boat. We have access to some tools that private developers do not, but we factor in the same thing and the same risk profiles.
Could I ask, can we, I was an art major in college, so could we go through your definitions of these three?
Yep.
Yeah, let's,
Certainly.
and then we can maybe
All the way.
dive into some bigger.
Yeah, backwards. Yep.
Tell me what slide.
What does affordable housing mean? That's what we're looking for. That one right there. All right. So, as I believe you know, but if not, a recap. The standard definition is that housing is affordable if you're not spending more than 30% of your gross income on housing-related costs. So that includes mortgage, utilities, rent, utilities, anything that goes into you residing in a dwelling unit. That's the standard definition. You're considered cost burdened if you're spending more than 30% of your gross income on your housing costs. It's important when we use the word affordable, there could be sort of two definitions of affordable. Capital A affordable, which you'll hear me use, is primarily discussed in terms of 60% AMI or lower. And this is where, to your point, Commissioner, that most folks get confused with workforce versus affordable or workforce housing that isn't affordable. Usually in most communities, when the standard citizen off the street is talking about affordability and affordable housing, they're usually referring to housing that is dedicated for certain income levels or below. Every housing unit is affordable to someone. Someone can afford a $2 million home or a $20 million home. Some of us can only afford a $200,000 or a $300,000 home. But everything is affordable to someone.
So this is one of the charts that drives me crazy. So affordable housing has a definition, and it has a definition even in that article that you reviewed and Trustee Brown put out. Is affordable housing is all these other projects that are government subsidized to make sure that any income level can afford them. Okay, so now this definition, I could put this definition all the way at the top end of workforce housing, because somebody who buys $1 million home here that has enough income is only spending 30%. Then by this definition, that house is affordable.
It is affordable to that household.
Right,
That's correct.
but that to me, this is a soft definition. This doesn't help us. You know, if we're breaking it into affordable housing, attainable housing, and workforce housing, but we use to say affordable housing is all of it, then that's part that creates confusion.
So I think
this is a terminology that was used 45 years ago when I bought my first house.
Me too.
My financial planner said you shouldn't be spending more than 25% of your
Yeah.
gross income. It just
still-
kind of it makes sense.
It's
To
still
some
the
extent.
metric
If you
that's
go
used.
beyond that, you're going to probably have a hard time dealing with the rest of your life issues.
And often what we're doing now is not only including housing costs in that, but transportation costs and combining those two. The definition both that you see on the screen in front of you and in the article is correct. That affordable housing is defined as a household that isn't spending more than 30% of their gross income on their housing costs. It's different when we start talking about AMI targeted
Right, exactly.
rent. And I want to correct something or a misconception from something that was just said. And this is sort of, if you go one more slide for me, please. It's worded a little awkwardly. However, one thing that affordable housing, particularly in our community, is it is not government subsidized. EPHA does not receive any money for our ongoing operation from the federal government or any other funding source. EPHA's operation and the housing that we provide is stood up on the rents that we charge, full stop. We don't receive ongoing financial assistance from any other entity. The town has provided us base funding since our existence. At one point in time, that was $250,000 annually. Prior to us having to relocate offices about 6 years ago now, we had that down to $28,000 a year. We turned around and paid almost $20,000 in IT costs. So effectively, we're a self-sufficient organization. Things have changed over the last few years. So we've increased that base funding a little bit from the town for a few years up to $50,000. And then we have now we take it from 6E, and there's been a little bit of an increase to make sure that we remain stable with all the new housing that we're bringing to market. But I want to make it perfectly clear that we do not receive subsidy from any other source.
So, but this chart is about you. It is about your organization and what we're doing here. It's not necessarily an overarching definition of affordable housing.
The definition I gave of the 30% is the national definition of affordable housing. Yes.
Okay, so if I'm making 60% AMI, then 30% of 60% is a significantly lower cost house than what even you all are providing. Yes?
No, we provide housing that hits those income targets. So if you could go forward, if you'll tell you when to stop.
We probably ought to get to the ought to get to the other.
Yeah, let's-
We could spend
let's-
all day talking about this
Yeah, let's
affordable
do
housing
the
discussion.
definitions first, please.
Because I think this is one of the things that confuses the heck out of all of us. But let's
Well,
get
we've covered the definitions pretty well.
Are you Dick? Do you think you have? You
Well,
understand
of
the definition?
affordable, I want to get all through. We're gonna.
So attainable is
next.
not really a defined term in the housing space, right? And what I have in a slide deck, one of the slides, sorry I can't control it.
What if you tell me which slide it's on, I can
Go back one, forward one.
you have a slide number in the right-hand corner.
12. Thank you. I was thinking when I did that, wasn't it? So, attainable housing in my mind, while it doesn't have a common definition in the housing space, I view it as available housing that matches the community's standard or predominant income levels and is generally attainable for members of the community. This can often be wide and ranging. In a community like ours, that tends to narrow in scope and volume, but it's a wide range, but that's how I define attainable housing when we talk about it.
Okay.
Again, in our code, it has a definition of 150% AMI or lower.
And again, just
So
to-
ideally, from a high level, real quick, is any houser's mission, whether you're providing housing to the private market or you're an organization like EPHA, of course, our mission is to remain focused on low to moderate income households. But you're trying to provide, to the best of your ability with the available resources, housing that meets the need, whether that's in a $4 million house or a $400 a month rent, which is really difficult to provide, but that we're trying to provide housing that matches the need in our community.
And again, just to reiterate, if a developer comes to us and says, I want to access this density bonus and I want to consider it attainable housing, there probably would be a legal deed restriction in there somewhere to say that if you don't meet that 150%, if you're above that, you don't qualify for this house.
Yes. So
Simply stated.
we write that into the deed restrictions. That's the way the recent deed restrictions have been written.
Yeah.
And then we ask EPHA and we compensate EPHA
To help
to
verify
ensure that those
Yeah.
requirements are met.
Yeah. So next slide up there is exactly
So
what you just mentioned.
so while we're on the deed restrictions, so when a developer comes to the planning commission and says, I want to get the 200% density bonus, or I want to get some portion of the density bonus, like was the previous. They didn't use the full density bonus. Are all of the homes deed restricted now, or just the percentage, or just the ones that they went over? So example, if they have 8 per acre and they ask for 16, are only 8 deed restricted and the other 8 are sold at whatever, or all of them deed restricted?
It's all 16.
So if they came and said, I'm doing only 60% of the 60% of the density bonus, I'm getting 4 houses instead of the 8, then still all 12 would be deed restricted. If they get any element of that density bonus, then all of them become deed restricted.
That's not the way it's been calculated.
Well, that's why I'm trying to understand exactly how is that done. If they get the full density bonus, all 16 houses are deed restricted.
So we're getting into math, but I'll give it a shot. So
Let's just do the 8 per acre because it's easy to do, right?
Well,
So
I'd make it even simpler. The St. Vrain property went from 8, no, was it 8 to 10?
8 to 12, 8 to 10.
8 to 10. They wanted 6 of them to be deed restricted to workforce housing. And the other 4 were going to be not. I mean, so there was some little math that went into that. So I think the answer was if they didn't go all the way up to the full 200%, then you could have some percentage of those deed restricted
If
from somewhere.
they're entitled
Simply stated.
if they're entitled to 8 and they want to use 10, then I believe the answer is that 2 of those 10 have to be deed restricted, and that's the way it's been interpreted in the past.
But if they do all 8, if they do the full 200%, all 16 are deed restricted.
Right.
So that really ought to be clarified in the code, because when we do update the development code, because that's not clear at all. That to how those deed restrictions are going to be applied doesn't seem to make any sense. That if you're using 25% of the density bonus, now you only get 2, but you use 100% of the bonus, now you get every single unit gets deed restricted.
So, Commissioner
Take a
Ortberg,
note.
leaving aside the question for a moment of whether one policy or the other is a better policy, there's a lot in the development code right now that requires interpretation by staff. So staff has been interpreting it a certain way for years, and I think it's a good exercise, a good task to look into that and see whether there are amendments that we want to make in order to direct policy from the town board level. And the planning commission can make recommendations to those effects.
Point of clarification, we have 30 minutes. So
Okay,
and we have a lot of territory to cover.
You're never going to cover it in the full.
Well, just
So I wanna touch on that for a minute and take a slight right turn in that. I'm trying to remember one thought I had, but in the meantime, I think allowing a level of flexibility in the development code as it's been interpreted now, as it relates to the bonus density, is important to keep in there in some fashion. And what I mean by that is I don't think it should be an all or nothing if you are requesting the density. If you don't go to the 200%, you should be allowed a portion at market, unrestricted, but the increase over, or the density that you received that comes with those restrictions, those obviously have to remain. And here's why I feel that way. Creating affordable housing, capital A affordable housing, or housing that meets the predominant need in our community is financially extremely difficult to nearly impossible without a few things. One, should have built it 25 years ago. 2, provide a bunch of subsidy to it, a bunch of equity up front, so that either the rent or the sales price matches an affordability profile that you're looking for, or you can subsidize that with market rate sales over here, but then subsidize the lower cost units. EPHA has done that in 2 instances, Vista Ridge and the Pines. One an ownership product, one a rental product. For Pines, we sold 23 of the 23 units. That effectively subsidized the other 25 of those units to offer low income, age restricted housing. And that is at the 60% AMI or lower. And Vista Ridge, roughly half of those were sold at market rate. The other half continually are subsidized, but are offered for sale at 80% AMI or lower. So that is another way that developers, whether it's EPH or private developers, can leverage a mixed development, so to speak, just in terms of their price point, to help drive the cost down of some units while selling some or offering some at a market rate. Any questions about deed restrictions since we touched on that? I've sensed a slight amount of confusion or just lack of knowledge around when the bonus density is allowed and given. Each one of those properties then goes under a restrictive covenant that then EPHA monitors. So there's ongoing monitoring on an annual or on a lease renewal basis where we verify, and we do third party, we do the full scope. It's not self-attestation. We verify from third-party sources that they meet the required definition of whatever is in the restriction that's associated with the unit they reside in. Are there any questions around how that works?
Yeah, Scott, if you have a 20-year deed restriction, and there's a change of conditions, can you say, okay, there's a change of conditions, so that 20-year deed restriction is only 7 years because things have changed?
I'll let Dan weigh in here, but I would say no. The deed restriction runs with the land. I think
Okay,
an owner
as long
could
as-
always
okay.
attempt to come back and renegotiate, but I don't think that would be a very amenable circumstance.
The short answer is no,
Okay.
because it's a covenant between the property owner and the town.
Got it.
Housing authority can't change the terms of that covenant. Theoretically, the town could, but we'd have to figure out the right process for that. It would be a decision of the board.
And there's no process for that right now.
No.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go over these pretty quickly, but I just wanted to highlight some of the income or rents and associated AMI levels that EPHA provides in their income aligned or capital A affordable units. So you can see 30 through 60% AMI in the associated rents. I think it's important to note, particularly at the 50 and 60% AMI levels, whether it's a 1 or all the way up to a 3-bedroom unit, these, our residents and our tenants, members of our workforce, are not paying $500 a month in rent. Those that occupy 60% 3-bedroom units now are paying $1,542 a month in rent. I'd venture to say that could be more than some of our mortgage payments if you still have a mortgage on your home and you bought it 20 years ago. Workforce rents bump up just a little bit. Oh, you stay same slide. Sorry, I moved my screen, but not the slide. So 1-bedroom we range from $1,248 to $1,363. You can read all the numbers. I'm proud of the fact that we're able to offer 4-bedroom units at Fall River Village for $2,636. And if you go to the next slide for me, as a comparison to Prospector, these are where Prospector rents currently sit: $1,945 for a 1-bedroom, $2,135 to $2,350 for a 2, and $2,585 for a 3-bedroom. I will note that I think shortly after Prospector opened, the opening property manager had those rental rates lowered for a multitude of reasons, but I think one of those is what EPHA was bringing to market, and that we were essentially undercutting the rents they were providing for a very similar product, which from an EPHA perspective is what we would like to see, right? We injected a lot of choice into the market, much lower rents, which caused them to have to come down $200 to $400 depending on the unit.
Sometime in the next 30 minutes, I'd like to expand a little bit on what you see going forward with some of the new additional monies, because that's pretty impressive to be able to come to market with a lower rate.
And
like that.
we're
I
on
think
that.
that's exactly what we need.
Yep, we're on that path to talk about that.
Okay.
So thank you. Just some associated income levels at those rent levels. This is what these numbers translate to in terms of annual gross household income to keep at that 30% threshold. 22. Slide 20. Oh, see, somehow I sent the wrong one. So we're missing a couple slides that I added last minute. The slide that's in front of me that you guys don't see is just this. It is a breakdown, which was included in one of your questions to town staff regarding who has used the bonus density to date. I think everyone saw that email, but there's 1, 2, 3, 6 developments currently that have used it: Grand Estates, Mountainwood, Wildfire,
That was in the
Like
Peakview,
236
and
units
Prospector.
altogether.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will mention that Grand Estates, I think being the first one, or one of the early ones, of course, was originally only 8 of those units were restricted. EPHA purchased that. We finally closed in early 24. That was a preservation play. That restriction was only valid for 20 years, so it was only valid another 16. And any new investor that would have come in to buy that property most likely would have had to raise rents about $400 to seek the type of return that that type of investor would be looking for. Hopefully I didn't miss too much. 23. Well, and I may have messed up what I provided you, unfortunately. So I'll just, without visuals to go with this, what did EPHA bring to market in 24? Starts to touch on what we've done and what's upcoming. So we provided 29 units at 60%, 44 units in the 70% AMI level, and 42 in the 80%.
Could you repeat those again?
29 in the 60% AMI threshold, 44 in the 70%, and 42 in the 80%. And I'll make sure the correct slide deck is out there. That's my mistake, that I must have sent an earlier version.
Yeah, maybe if you could even provide the slide deck and we can get access to it, Karen, that'd be great.
next one, just see where I'm at. Keep going. Okay. So we missed a few, which is unfortunate, and that's my fault. Last year, what year? We were in 2025. So for 2024, I prepared it in 23. That's what threw me off. Was given all the changes in housing, and of course 6E as a funding source, we created the first annual housing supply plan. That was a tongue twister for me. The 2024 version is on our website. The draft 2025 version is in front of me. And it is really meant to be a report that's updated on an annual basis based on what we see in the market, coming to market, primarily focused on workforce, attainable, and affordable housing. So I encourage anyone.
It's on your website?
Yes. And the 2025 version will be out there soon. I'll probably publish the draft version with an acknowledgement that there may be some changes to it. I'm waiting on a few key things which may go into this report, which is why I just haven't finalized it with our board yet. And my apologies for missing a few of the visuals here, but when we compare what's upcoming to versus what the housing needs assessment stated, so the 2022 or early 2023 housing needs assessment stated that by 2030, between a catch-up need to get us on an even keel to a future need, we would need 2,720 additional housing units. Currently in our pipeline, we only have 300.
I didn't get the 2,000.
2,720. And currently in our pipeline, nope, it's not in there. Sorry. I'm not sure what I sent you, but it wasn't the correct one. We only have 350 units in the pipeline, even if we look out as far as 2030.
I'd like to ask your opinion on that assessment report, because it seems to be sort of much maligned. And I think the reason, I'm not sure what metrics they were using to say if you work up here that you need to have a housing unit up here versus, you work up here like our school superintendent, but her husband works in Greeley and they've chosen to live in Longmont or somewhere else. Did it factor that sort of stuff in there? Because I think a lot of people are looking at that housing assessment going way too high.
Yeah, it certainly
I'd like
did.
to get your opinion on that.
Yep, it did not assume a one-for-one relationship in the example you provide, right? Statistically, it's been relatively stable that roughly a third of our workforce over the past 15 years commutes in. It isn't assumed that that third of the workforce that commutes in, all of that third of the workforce desires to live in Estes for some of the reasons that you just outlined. Dual income families, they might be better placed to reside down the hill and one member commutes up. We can also see the reverse of that. So it did not assume a one-to-one ratio when it comes to that. My opinion on the needs assessment is it accurately stated in broad terms to the best of anyone's crystal ball ability with the census data and forward-looking demographic data that is used that goes into those figures, that it did accurately represent the needs in the Estes Valley. There are a lot of inputs into why new housing units are needed, and they're very complex. And I'll have you fast forward here a little bit.
So, quick question for you. So, if I just do some quick fighter pilot math, so one of the things in your YouTube presentation was the limitation on housing is also availability of land. So, if we're going to build 2,400 units to make up the gap by 2030, and we're building our density is 8 units per acre, that means we got to find 300 acres of land to build these units on. And even if we provide the 200% density bonus, we have to find another 150 acres. So where do we find 150 acres in the Estes Valley within the R3 school district that is going to open up their land for that kind of development?
So a few things. One, we don't ever assume that we're going to build our way out of the housing shortage. While new builds are part of it, we can't build our way out of what we have. A repurposing of existing stock or redevelopment of existing previously developed land is a critical piece to solving the housing shortage. So we don't need to find the metrics or that available of undeveloped vacant land to build on. It is not EPHA's intent to try to build our way out. And I think that's evidenced by the opportunities that we took advantage of in 2024 in converting two properties that were previously used as short-term rentals or lodging establishments, converting those because they made sense to do so. Not all lodging establishments make sense to convert into long-term housing, but these did. And we converted 112 units in 2024. So you can bring new housing to market in a multitude of ways. Repurposing is one way. Better utilizing the land that is currently developed is another significant way. It does not all have to be greenfield new development to help meet our housing need. There are a lot of factors that go into the pressure and the housing shortage and the need for more housing. This graphic in front of you, which is more looking at a national level, but I think it's applicable, shows some pretty stark differences between household makeup in 1950 versus 2017. And basic math can tell you why housing has gotten more expensive, or at least how this contributes to more expensive housing, is we have more housing per square foot per person than we used to by quite a bit. Another common thing, and this pains me to say this out loud, but one thing that we see in this community, and I think national trends, state demographic trends, national demographic trends, in my opinion, are exasperated in small communities like ours. We're experiencing similar things that the whole nation is experiencing, whether that's housing shortages, but the changing demographics. Our population is aging. The use and how homes are used, how they're lived in, is changing, not only on a national level, but certainly on a local level. We feel them more, I think, in a small environment than you do at a national level here locally. But one thing that we see locally is new household creation doesn't just happen from people moving in. That's evidenced by the fact that our population in Estes has relatively remained static over the past almost 2 decades. We've remained in Estes proper right around 5,900. Outside, in the greater, let's use the school district boundaries roughly, that population has grown by a few thousand over that same time period, but Estes Park has remained relatively static. The last large increase in our population that we saw in Estes was between 1990 and 2000, where we gained about 2,000 or so. Don't hold me totally to those numbers, but those are approximate numbers. That's the last large increase. I can think of nearly 20 households right off the top of my head locally within the last 14-ish months that we've gone from needing one household to house the family to now 2 due to divorce or separation and family changes. Those real life changes impact the housing market. A family that only took 1 unit now needs 2. That doubles your housing need in isolation, right? So I bring these up because the pressure and need for additional housing units is not as simple as we oftentimes like to make it in conversations. It's a very complex living system with a lot of inputs that can be hard to measure and gauge.
So in Colorado is not growing right now, last year. Or very little.
Yeah.
And that's a trend that they're seeing. I mean, the last reports that I saw on that was that we actually lost population. So, and that's taken into these reports too, right?
It is.
I mean, because we see it in Estes too, but we see it
Yes.
throughout the whole
So the
state.
housing needs assessment takes those projections into consideration as well, and really looks at job growth or anticipated job growth as a driver to housing need as well.
We have about, just a time check again, 15 minutes here.
Okay.
I want to make sure everybody gets their burning questions asked and answered.
Well, Chair Cooper, this might be an opportunity for me to correct myself from earlier.
Okay.
If the hypothetical with 8 units bumping up to 10, we were just conferring. I think the correct answer is actually that 4 would be required to be
required. And,
attainable or workforce.
So 2 that got added to the density bonus plus 2 from the, okay.
To avoid the issue you were raising.
Okay.
I know you're watching. Thanks. another graphic, which again, I'll say that I stole these. I didn't. These are published by this architecture firm out of Atlanta, who is kind enough to share all of their presentation material. And I like the way they lay a lot of things out, which is why I included some of them. These are focused on again, national basis, but applicable to ours. And this shows a decline in small starter home construction, right? The market, through various forces, and then what's allowed under zoning, has gone to where the money is, so to speak. What's profitable? What can a developer that doesn't have the advantage of bringing in other sources of funding, such as public housing providers, such as EPHA, where do they go? They go to building what can make them a reasonable amount of money, where they can mitigate the risk that they take. And that is a one significant driver to why you've seen this precipitous drop in small homes or starter home construction. It is incredibly difficult to make that model pencil out or make it financially feasible to deliver. Looking forward, and it's kind of going back, but looking forward at the same time, one of the developments that EPHA is working on in coordination with the town is development at Fish Hatchery. And I'm going to span a few different talking points here as we approach time. But it is an opportunity for us to add much needed housing stock in the Estes Valley. Our next public and first official public neighborhood meeting for Fish Hatchery is, I believe, scheduled for March 28th at 5 or 5:30 p.m. As developments go and the iterations of planning these developments go, EPHA, along with the development team, knew that the first thing we put on paper, where we actually had the architect sketch out what a development could look like, what the unit mix is, where they might go, we knew what we put on paper with the restrictions we were aware of at the time didn't match our development code. Meaning, we knew that what we ideally want to put here and what the housing needs assessment says we need, and what our community surveys say our residents would like to see in terms of housing, we couldn't build it because it's not allowed under the current development code. And it's not allowed for a multitude of reasons. One of those is we don't have the flexibility to provide what the market wants to see. Meaning we couldn't build small single-family homes on small lots, even if that's desired. It's not allowable in general terms. Through a few iterations, and we'll make the what we believe is getting closer to what that development may look like. We've had to combine units into duplexes, triplexes to fit the development code. Those come with their own complications. Some of those work in our favor, some do not. But that's what's currently allowed under the development code. All that to say, though, is that all of the exercises that go into this, whether it's our Riverside property, Fish Hatchery, we have to get these to a point where we, and both of the properties I just mentioned are now at this stage, where we can begin to get construction cost estimates to see how feasible they are. One of our last pieces of land that we got to the same point in sort of our pre-development work on, our construction cost estimates on a per door basis came out at $908,000 a door. Not tenable.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to touch on, if you go, it's 67 on mine. I don't know if that's accurate or not. No, keep going. You're good. It's pretty deep in. That one right there. So locally, one of the significant things and one of the significant factors and our ability to provide housing stock, we still need housing at all income levels. Our market is somewhat bifurcated, or at least was at the last housing needs assessment, in that we have a significant need at the lower end, and lower is 50% or lower than that. And then sort of this 80, 100% AMI and higher, both on the rental and for purchase. From our perspective, one of the significant tools that we have available to us is adding restricted inventory, whether that's conversion or new development. So when a new developer comes along, and wants to use the bonus density, and as such is required to reserve that unit or a subset of those units to the local workforce at either an attainable level or just for the workforce that doesn't come with those income restrictions, that's really important for a high desirable market like Estes. Our ability to add restricted stock where its ultimate end use is restricted on who can live there is absolutely critical to not only create available housing for our local workforce, but also maintain it over the long term. So I think that should be a consideration for this group when considering the applicability of bonus density, where it may be appropriate, where it's not. I'm gonna a few things around zoning that I do want to touch on. From housing's perspective, from EPHA's perspective, the comprehensive plan should be used as much as is possible and feasible as that guiding document to help us pinpoint where and how we can better utilize areas in the Estes Valley to add gentle density and additional housing stock. There are areas in our valley that are appropriate for redevelopment. They are appropriate for higher density. When you're talking about development at its core, if we back up to a national level, 8 units per acre is extremely low. I understand, as well as anyone else does in this community, that may not feel low to us, but from a numbers and cents development aspect, 8 is very low. And it's very difficult to get some of these projects to pencil without some additional density. If I'm gonna have to build curb and gutter for sidewalk X number of linear feet, that's gonna be $55,000, whether I have 4 units there or 10, that cost is still gonna be the same. But if it's 10 units, I can spread that cost out over those 10 units, or I can't do that, or the same cost is spread out over the 4 units. That example I give is real. Peakview, 26 units, EPHA's development. Our curb and gutter cost for the sidewalk on Highway 7 from basically our monument sign out was $56,268, somewhere in that range. We were able to spread that over all 26, but if we had only been able to do 16, that per unit cost goes up, and then most likely the amount of rent that we have to charge goes up. All these things are intertwined and related. So our ability to use that comprehensive plan as our guiding document on where it's appropriate to add density. And density does not always need to look like a 3-story square box apartment building. I am a giant proponent of PUDs combined with that bonus density aspect. PUDs, I think, actually give a greater level of control over what can be required from a given development. And PUDs can allow those of us who develop housing specifically to be more flexible in what we can provide. But truth be told, we're often put in a box of what we can provide because it has to fit in very linear ways when we talk about landscaping, setbacks, open space requirements, all of these things. We can't be as creative as we might otherwise be able to be if the development code allowed us to do so. Go to the next slide real quick. What do I have, about 8 minutes? If that?
So I'm assuming you're putting your some recommendations into to the planning guys, the staff, on where you see improvements in the development code that could potentially improve our housing.
I think when the time in that process is appropriate, we will be, yes.
Well,
Please do.
you just started them, right? So we don't want them to get wedded to writing the whole thing, and then you come in and say, hey, I really would like 17,000 changes. So I think now's the time, so that they can consider all of those while they're looking. Isn't that what you want for the new guy that's writing the new development code and looking at that to have some inputs now?
Chair and Commissioners, that is very correct. Mr. Milton will be very involved. We're not there yet, but point is well taken. Right now, we're kind of still doing some background work. No code writing has started. That won't start maybe summer at earliest, but Housing Authority will be dialed in.
Yeah, I hope we give a lot of those folks like the housing authority enough notice so they can get their thoughts all wrangled together and figure out what they want to provide as input.
Yes, sir.
So that it's not a surprise and get something less than value.
They'll probably be tired of hearing from us.
Good,
So.
okay.
A couple last things that I want to leave you with real quick. One is anytime you can or want to have me back, if you do, to ask more questions, more information, more than willing and able to do that. Local real estate data, as we ended 2024, median sales price for detached was on 809, 809,000. Median sales price for completed transactions in 24 for attached was 580,000. If you go back a slide, you can see how quickly that's changed from when this report was generated, which was the tail end of 2022. That was approaching 600,000. So you can see the relatively quick change. And again, I don't know what mistake I made with the reporting here, but one of you also asked for some data on what is on the market now, I believe. And there are currently 77 attached dwelling units on the market for a median price of $487,000. Median age of those listings is 27 years old. Detached active listings 65. Median price of $895,000 with a median age of 31 years. I think it's important to also realize the age of our housing stock.
So what are you talking to here? You're
Different-
quoting numbers I don't see on these charts.
Yeah, sorry, it didn't make it in the slide deck. So the numbers that I just mentioned are not up there. Current active listings as of now, as of yesterday.
Is that part of your annual housing supply document?
It is
Okay.
not, because
No.
it changes at any given moment, but
Okay.
one of you
But
asked that
is
in
that,
an email.
is that information you readily have available?
Not readily. I can obtain it, but
But if we asked for it
Can
maybe
you
every
send those
6
numbers?
months,
that I could do.
okay, because that will be a request that's going to come from me.
Yep, I can.
Can
do
you
that.
send those numbers that you just quoted to us?
Yes,
and give
I'll
them to Karen?
make sure you have the updated slide deck, which has this slide in it.
Okay.
So I'll make sure that Karen has the correct slide deck, so everything that I intended to be in here is in
And what do
here.
you mean about the attached versus detached? Do you mean single family home versus
Correct.
a duplex?
Correct. Well, thank you. I know we kind of ran out of time, but hopefully this was helpful to you all. Again, feel free to
still
invite
have
me
3
back
more
anytime.
minutes.
We do it? Well, I just didn't want to run long.
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys allowing me to come talk
No, I
with you.
appreciate
Hopefully it
a
was
couple comments that you made, and I especially, I'm interested in your comparison of the rents that you charge for the workforce housing that you've developed at Peakview versus Prospector. And I think we just need to have more of that, because I think, we desperately need more affordable housing in the marketplace. I've heard over the last 18 to 24 months, a few people say a few things that I'm not sure is real or BS. One of which is the only reason that developers are doing the density bonus is to make more money. What I heard you say is, from your perspective, that density is really necessary to get more units into the marketplace.
Yes.
The other thing I've heard a couple times is the only reason we're doing this density is so that the county and the city can make more tax dollars. I mean, I don't think the county or the city's in cahoots with anybody here to do that, but it's just one of those comments that you hear once in a while.
So, but I want to clarify what you just said versus what I thought you said was what really developers do is they need to make their equity work for them, whether it be 0.5% or it be 22% that they make. So the density bonus allows them to make use of their equity. So it is about, in
To- to-
respect,
yes,
making
yes.
money.
Making
but-
it work.
Right, but finding that right density, and we heard that on the St. Vrain property, that they needed those units in order to make the numbers work out. But that also gets matched with the size of the unit they're building, how complex that unit is, and what those costs are. So it's bigger than just the type of units they build in those situations. A 3,000 square foot home on 10 units or 12 units on that 1 acre is different than building 8 units that are 1,500 square foot homes on that same property because the footprint looks dramatically different to the rest of the community, right? Is that
It's-
fair?
I think I would agree with that, but it's about providing some level of equilibrium to that risk. And
Agreed,
Can
but-
you deliver something?
But
that
it's the risk on
community
their
needs?
equity that ultimately drives developers, right?
Yes.
So they're not going to build something up here to lose money.
So correct, but that density, that bonus density is a carrot, right? It is intended to spur development. And we talked about that earlier. The 17 years that the previous density bonus wasn't used, the market told you why. It's that the economic strings attached to it did not make sense. So if we want to leave all housing development in the workspace, attainable, affordable space to EPHA, we can play that role, but I will tell you, we need the private market to provide housing units as well. We cannot provide it all. There are not enough resources.
I agree with you. I'm just saying that at times developers overreach for the size of property they're in because that's what they have in their mind that is going to make it easier to sell. But necessarily, that's not necessarily the best footprint for that area because they could build a smaller one. An example is in St. Vrain. After the St. Vrain thing was all settled with the trustees, I had a number of engineers that had advised that builder that they were too big for the property size and that they could build something that was still great housing for up here and comparable to the market, but it wasn't 3,000 square foot a unit.
I think that's probably a fair statement.
Okay, I think we're 1 minute overtime, but I appreciate your timing, and if you could get us the slide deck to Karen, that'd be really great. I appreciate all that effort that you put into this. So
Thank you again.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks.
it.
we will
Appreciate it.
probably ask you back again.
More than happy to do it.
Which book should we read first?
I have 40 more in my office. Feel free to come grab them.